Welcome to Citizen Portal, the federal edition, your go-to source for everything happening in federal politics. Let's dive in and keep you connected to what matters most on the national stage. Right. Hey, everyone. Welcome back. So today we're going deep on a topic that honestly has been a bit of a hot-button issue, debanking.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, we keep hearing about banks closing the accounts of perfectly lawful businesses and individuals. And, well, frankly, we want to understand what's going on too, right?
Yeah, absolutely.
So we've got a whole stack of sources here, congressional testimony, legal opinions, the works. And thankfully, we've got our expert here to guide us through it all and kind of connect the dots.
Yeah, well, happy to be here. It's definitely a complex issue. We'll give you that. We're going to be seeing some conflicting narratives, about whether this is all driven by overly cautious regulators or the political leanings of bank executives or something else entirely.
Yeah, and it's not just about numbers on a spreadsheet, right? We're talking about people losing their livelihoods. One of our sources here, Nathan McCauley, he's the CEO of Anchorage Digital. Now, Anchorage Digital is a federally chartered crypto bank. And he actually testified before Congress about his company's struggles with this whole thing. Imagine, having your bank account just shut down, and then you get rejected by 40 other banks. I mean, they couldn't even make payroll.
Yeah, that's a pretty stark example of how regulatory uncertainty can have a real chilling effect on businesses and, even those that are operating completely within the law. But then on the other hand, we also have this case of Old Glory Bank. So Old Glory Bank was founded specifically to serve these customers who have been debanked. And their CEO, Mike Ring, he's suggesting that political ideology is a major factor at play here. So is this a market solution to the problem, or is it just a symptom of even deeper kind of societal divisions?
Okay, before we get too far ahead of ourselves here, let's take a step back for a second and define debanking in plain English. So what are we actually talking about here?
Yeah, so basically debanking is when a financial institution closes a customer's account. They deny them access to those essential banking services. And, this can range from a small credit union, dropping someone for too many overdrafts, all the way up to a major bank severing ties with an entire industry.
So it's not always some sinister plot, right?
Yeah.
Sometimes it's just a bank managing risk.
But, when we talk about the really controversial stuff that's making headlines, there are two main types of debanking to focus on: regulatory debanking and then participant debanking.
All right, so break those down for us. Regulatory debanking sounds like it's coming from the top down. Is this the government influencing banks' decisions?
Yeah, you got it. Precisely. It's when those regulators, like the FDIC, the Federal Reserve, they create this environment where banks become really hesitant to serve certain industries or customers for fear of scrutiny or penalties or even just damage to their reputation.
Ah, that reputational risk thing. It's like a sword hanging over banks' heads, right? So would the Anchorage Digital situation, would that be a prime example of regulatory debanking?
Yeah, it definitely fits the pattern. McCauley, he testified that even though they're a federally chartered bank operating in the crypto space, they still faced a ton of difficulty just finding basic banking partners. And he pointed to a whole series of regulatory actions that kind of created this climate of fear around crypto in general. And that's what led banks to distance themselves from the entire sector.
But then we have Old Glory Bank. They were created specifically to serve these folks who have been debanked. And the CEOs suggesting it's more about banks voluntarily choosing who to serve based on, let's just say aligned values. That's participant debanking, right?
Exactly, yeah. So that's when banks make independent decisions to avoid certain customers or certain industries, but it's based on their own internal risk assessments. But those assessments can be influenced by factors that go beyond just the purely financial risks,
So are we talking about the personal beliefs of bank executives influencing these decisions? Is that what's going on here?
Well, that's the allegation. And Ring actually gave some pretty compelling examples, citing cases like former President Trump's wife being denied banking services, whether this is a super widespread problem or just some isolated incidents. That's definitely a matter of debate.
This is getting complicated fast. It's like this tangled web of regulation and individual choices and a whole lot of gray areas.
Oh, yeah, it really is. And to really understand how we got here, we need to dig into the regulatory landscape a bit. We've got some testimony here from Stephen Gannon. He's a lawyer who actually represents both banks and digital asset firms. And he's arguing that regulators often use these really vague concepts like reputational risk, which can be applied inconsistently or even subjectively, and it leaves banks in this really tough spot where they're just not sure where they stand.
Okay, now this is where it gets really interesting. Gannon actually specifically mentioned these pause letters that the FDIC sent to banks that were engaged in any kind of crypto-related activities, like basically a not-so-subtle way of telling them to back off, right?
Yeah, it's definitely a form of regulatory pressure. And Gannon's arguing that these actions, along with just, increased supervisory scrutiny and the potential for getting negative bank ratings, it creates this chilling effect that goes way beyond just the crypto industry.
So, like, banks are basically being encouraged to just err on the side of caution, even if it means shutting out legitimate businesses. Sounds like a lot of innocent bystanders are getting caught in the crossfire here.
Yeah, that's a valid concern for sure. But we can't forget about the role of those anti-money laundering regulations, or AML, and the Bank Secrecy Act, the BSA. These regulations are meant to prevent financial crimes. But Aaron Klein from the Brookings Institution, he pointed out that they also create this huge compliance burden for banks.
Yeah, and Klein argued that the current system actually incentivizes banks to drop low-profit customers, who might trigger more scrutiny even if they're not doing anything wrong. That seems a little counterintuitive, doesn't it?
It does, yeah. He highlighted this really striking contrast. This Japanese baseball star, he kept his bank account even after having like $17 million fraudulently wired into it, versus thousands of everyday people who are losing their accounts due to like really minor issues. It raises some serious questions about whether the system is actually working the way it's supposed to.
So, solutions, right? Like, is there any hope of actually untangling this mess?
Well, there are definitely some ideas being floated around. One that's gaining some traction is this thing called the Fair Access to Banking Act. The whole idea is to try and prevent banks from discriminating against entire industries, based on just political or social
Oh,
considerations.
no more like blanket bans on gun manufacturers or crypto businesses,
Yeah.
just because someone in Washington doesn't like them.
Yeah, in theory, that's the goal. The act would basically require banks to base their decisions on individual risk assessments rather than these super broad exclusions.
Okay, that sounds fair enough. But wouldn't that, like, create mountains of paperwork for banks? I mean, imagine having to justify every single account closure.
Yeah, that's a valid point for sure. And it's something lawmakers would definitely have to consider very carefully. Another solution that's been proposed is all about transparency.
Ah, so shining a light on those shady pause letters and all that behind-the-scenes pressure that Gannon was talking about.
Exactly. If regulators were required to, actually provide clear written justification for their actions, it would be much harder for them to operate in the shadows and potentially engage in those politically motivated decisions.
Yeah, but wouldn't that also, like, tie the regulators' hands a bit, make them hesitant to act even when it's actually justified? I mean, there's always a trade-off for
And
that.
there is, yeah, for sure. Finding that right balance is going to be absolutely crucial. Um, Another area that's ripe for reform is that suspicious activity reporting regime, the SARS.
Ah, the SARS.
Yeah.
If I'm remembering correctly, Klein was arguing that the whole system is, like, totally overloaded, leading banks to overreport, even on those low-risk customers. He suggested maybe focusing on specific types of activity, like elder abuse or something, to make the system a little more effective.
Yeah, that's definitely an idea worth exploring. Reducing the sheer volume of those SARs could free up a lot of resources, allowing investigators to really zero in on those genuinely high-risk cases. There's also been some talk about providing more feedback to the banks, on the actual usefulness of their reports, which could really help improve the overall quality of the information.
So instead of just blindly filing millions of SARs, banks would actually have a better understanding of what's actually helping law enforcement, right? Like actually catching the bad guys.
Exactly. It's all about shifting the focus from quantity to quality, which could benefit everyone involved.
Okay, so these solutions all sound pretty good in theory. But I can't help but wonder about those unintended consequences. Could these changes actually make it harder for banks to manage risk effectively? Or even, like, open the door to more financial crime?
Right. That's always a risk when you're dealing with these really complex systems. The key is to find those solutions that actually address the core problems of debanking without undermining those legitimate goals of financial regulation.
Easier said than done, though, right? It feels like we're walking this tightrope between all these competing priorities.
We are, yeah, and it's a tightrope we got to walk very carefully because the stakes are high. Debanking has some real consequences for people, for businesses, and for the overall economy.
It's not just some, like, abstract policy debate. It's about people's ability to actually participate in society. If you can't access basic banking service, you're essentially locked out of the modern economy.
Precisely. And as our financial system becomes more and more digital, the risks and the consequences of debanking are only going to become more and more pronounced.
Which brings us right back to this central question of this whole deep dive, right? Is debanking mainly driven by overregulation or political bias? Or just the inherent challenges of AML and BSA compliance? Or is it like some messy combination of all three?
Yeah, it's most likely a combination of factors. And trying to disentangle them isn't easy. We've heard some pretty compelling arguments on both sides. Ultimately, it's up to each individual to weigh the evidence and kind of decide for themselves which narrative they find most persuasive.
And that's exactly what this deep dive is all about, right? Equipping you with the knowledge and the insights you need to form your own informed opinions.
Exactly. It's not about telling you what to think, but rather giving you the tools to think critically and engage with these really complex debates.
Because as we've seen, this issue is so far from black and white. There are shades of gray everywhere you look.
Oh yeah, for sure. And navigating those shades of gray requires careful consideration and thoughtful analysis and a willingness to engage with all those different perspectives.
Speaking of different perspectives, one thing that really stood out to me was the contrast between Macaulay's and Ring's experiences. They were both dealing with debanking, but they seem to have very different views on the root causes.
Yeah, that's a great observation. And it really highlights how important it is to avoid those simplistic explanations. Macaulay, as the CEO of that federally chartered crypto bank, he saw firsthand the impact of regulatory uncertainty and pressure on his whole industry.
Right, while Ring, as the founder of a bank that's specifically catering to the debanked, he witnessed the role of those individual choices and potentially those political motivations.
Yeah, and their experiences offer some really valuable insights into the kind of multifaceted nature of this whole problem. It's not just a simple case of banks versus regulators or conservatives versus liberals. It's this complex interplay of factors that just defy easy categorization.
Which is why it's so important to consider all sides of the story, right? To dig beneath the surface and challenge our own assumptions.
Yeah, and to be willing to revise those assumptions as we encounter new evidence and new perspectives.
Exactly. It's striking how much power regulators seem to have in this whole debanking situation. It's one thing to enforce clear rules, but this whole strategic ambiguity thing that Gannon was talking about is, I don't know, kind of unsettling.
Right. It's like they're shaming the entire financial landscape without clear legal authority, just by dropping hints and raising eyebrows. That's a lot of power concentrated in the hands of just a few people.
And for you listening, this means the businesses you might rely on every day. For loans, for processing payments, for just everyday transactions, those businesses could be caught in the crosshairs, not because they broke any laws, but because of this, regulatory shadow game.
Exactly. Remember that quote from Macaulay's testimony? He said something like, "It's not just about crypto anymore. This fear is spreading, and any industry could be next."
So what's the average person supposed to do? We can't all become legal experts in financial regulation overnight, right? But you can at least be informed, and proactive. First off, know your rights. If a bank ever denies you an account or a service, don't just take it lying down, right? Push back a little, ask for specific reasons, and see if, any consumer protection laws might apply.
Yeah, don't be afraid to make a little noise. The squeaky wheel gets the grease, right?
Exactly. And here's a practical tip. Don't put all your eggs in one basket. Having accounts at a couple different institutions, that can be your real safety net, especially if one bank gets, a little skittish about your industry or, let's be honest, your political views.
Yeah, diversification is key. And not just for investments, but for your basic financial stability.
This deep dive has been eye-opening, to say the least. Debanking is a seriously complex issue. There's no easy answers. What I really hope you take away from this is a sense of urgency. This is happening right now, and it really does affect all of us.
Yeah, we've laid out the information. We've explored the arguments on both sides. Now it's up to you. What do you believe? And how are you going to act? Will you just sit back and observe? Or will you fight for a more inclusive, more transparent financial system?
And here's one final thought to leave you with. As technology keeps evolving with things like digital currencies and decentralized finance, will that make debanking easier or harder? Will it empower individuals? Or will it just create new ways to exclude people?
That's a question we should all be asking ourselves. The future of finance is being written right now, and we all have a role to play in shaping it.
Thanks for joining us for this deep dive, everyone. We'll see you next time. Thanks for tuning in to Citizen Portal. We hope you feel more informed and ready to engage with the issues shaping our community. Be sure to subscribe so you never miss an update, and visit us at citizenportal.ai for more insights on how local politics are impacting you. Until then, stay engaged, stay informed, and remember, your voice matters.